Hi there and welcome to this session on the strategic role of learning in a connected world. I'm talking today to Simon Terry, and Simon provides consulting, advice and speaking and thought leadership to global clients through his own consulting practice and is chairman and owner of Change Agents Worldwide. Change Agents is a network of progressive and passionate professionals specialising in future of work technologies and practices. Simon's practice focuses on assisting organisations to transform customer experience, collaboration and leadership through leverage of purposeful, agile and innovative teams. Simon writes on social collaboration, leadership, digital transformation and the future of work at his blog. The link to that is in the show notes, and on Twitter. And Simon was previously CEO of HiCaps, one of Australia's leading healthcare payment solutions, and has experience in senior management and transformation in financial services, e-commerce, consumer goods, media and telecommunications. So after that quite a big intro, hi Simon, welcome.
Hi Karen, how are you?
Good, thank you. Well, I might just let you kick off and we will chat as we go through.
Fantastic. So what I wanted to talk today around is how learning is becoming the challenge that all organisations must develop an expertise in, and importantly, how the learning function needs to make sure that's happening across the breadth of the organisation. And what I want to do to start is begin by looking a little bit back in time and seeing how the nature of the way our organisations approach their work has changed over time. So if we start at the beginning of modern organisations, if we look at a period like 1816, back before modern communications and modern transport technology, organisations found themselves isolated and really were stuck on the limits of what an individual could achieve. In this era, we saw that success was very much like this baker, working in one location, using a particular set of expertise and a particular set of assets and people available in that location to create a market for their business. The opportunities were particularly small and particularly narrow. And so, you know, the learning function based off guilds and apprenticeship was very much around learning and expertise to be able to take advantage of that location. Now, obviously, our world's moved on, and in about 100 years ago, in 1916, we had a scenario where transport networks were beginning to develop. By now, we had the car, and we had railways, and we had global communications. We even had the birth of the airline industry that we have today. And we also had modern telecommunications starting to be developed, and particularly powered by, at first, the telegraph. And what you had now was the beginnings of the modern organisation. All of a sudden, someone could control and shape activity over even a global sphere. And what that did in terms of the nature of our organisations was we started to see value be created through process focus, through focus on consistency of outputs. And here we're looking at an example of the Model T Ford, you know, the first production line producing, you know, the same output, building it off a set of common competencies, skills and capabilities. And this idea was phenomenally successful in our organisations. I mean, essentially almost all the traditional organisations we know today are modelled off the early developments at the beginning of the 20th century in the organisation. And in a sense, the way we think about learning in our organisations has been driven by this process and consistency mindset. Putting aside our focus in learning around compliance and meeting skills, we drive a lot of our learning to meet a specific competency that matches into a process requirement in the organisation. We've very much seen it as delivering consistency of an employee outcome to achieve value. And that is built off this, you know, rich history over 100 years of organisations trying to create value in global markets by delivering a consistent product and managing the efficiency of their processes to be able to deliver that consistency. If you think about where we are now in 2016, we're starting to see the beginnings of a change. We're starting to see the beginnings of a transformation. Because what's happened is communication networks, transportation has moved even further. We've now reached this point where everything is connected to everything else. We have mobile technology. We have things like 3D printing that even start to challenge whether we need transportation at all. Can people develop things locally? And we're starting to see organisations become much more interwoven into their environment. They're connected to suppliers, they're connected to customers in real time through social networks, through communication networks, through even built into the way they develop their products and their activities. And particularly, we've learnt a great deal through innovations in the way businesses are started up, through things like lean startup and other technologies, that we're starting to see this world where actually learning and collaboration are at the heart of value creation, because they're at the heart of how organisations change. And if you think about in your organisation, a lot of the strategic demands that are coming from the senior executives, from the CEO suite, from the board, and from senior management, we're starting to see that there is a theme of learning and adapting to the environment that sits at the heart of many of these transformational techniques and approaches. If you think about the strategic imperative of learning, we're seeing it everywhere in our organisations. We have project processes like agile that are about enabling projects to continuously adapt and learn from implementation, improve the implementation effectively. We're seeing design thinking be built through our product development processes and built out into the way we develop new ways to engage customers and the way we operate our processes in the organisation. And design thinking is fundamentally a learning approach. It's about quickly developing ideas, putting them into tests, working with customers, working with insight and learning as you go. We see that kind of approach playing out in the way organisations are adopting experimentation. I saw something the other day to give you an example of the power of experimentation in learning. Amazon.com has the ability to stream customers into different experiences so that it can do A/B tests in its environment. Because of Amazon's massive scale on a global basis, they can run a test with over 50,000 customers having a different experience of Amazon.com in 54 seconds. That means they can run tests and learn new ways of working, tests and learn new ways of operating, and put that into implementation really quickly, often without their competitors ever noticing. So across this entire landscape, we're seeing very different ways of people starting to work, very different ways of people starting to try and improve their organisation's adaptiveness and effectiveness, and this is often driven by a strategic imperative to learn and to change faster and to enable people to continuously improve their effectiveness. Now the challenge...
So I was just going to say, sorry. I think the key word there is continuous, isn't it? I think historically when we've looked at things like learning and businesses, there's been an end point. So, you know, if we need to achieve this desired outcome, so we're going to do this and then that's going to happen and then we move on to something else. Whereas I think now it's kind of more, we're working more in a, like working out loud, more in a live environment, and we're just constantly tweaking and adjusting to improve. There isn't so much an end goal anymore, that there's more of a vision, if you like.
Yeah, and I think the recognition we have, because of the connected global world we have, you know, you no longer have a defined set of competitors. You no longer have a standard of their performance. We're in a situation where that bar is continuously moving for individuals, for organisations, and for customers. And I think that's the point you're making, Karen, is that suddenly our challenge in thinking about learning in this context is it's no longer about, you know, defining a set or doing a needs analysis and defining a specific set of competencies and hitting that mark.
No.
This environment we're in challenges us to go so much further.
And I think because at the rate that businesses are operating at, and that, you know, the business itself is being agile and, you know, on top of their game and moving forward, and we need to catch up with that.
Exactly, because, you know, a lot of this activity we're seeing is being driven with little or no involvement of the learning function in these organisations.
Unfortunately.
This is where business has taken, you know, the learning industry has always wanted the business to lead the learning. Well, guess what? They're doing it.
Yeah. So look out.
And I think that so you know that's the opportunity, and the challenge becomes this forces us in learning to start to rethink the way we approach this space, because all of a sudden some of these challenges are beyond what we've ever considered the role of learning before. And also the question becomes, how does learning insert itself into the organisational dialogue around these strategic imperatives? You know, we always hear the conversation about how does learning get a seat at the table. And what we're seeing now is the idea of learning is the table. You know, the idea of learning is where that senior leadership conversation is occurring. Continuous capability development, learning, responsiveness, agility. This is all driven by global connection and digital disruption. But the question becomes, how can learning play a role in that space? And I think that's what we want to explore in the rest of this conversation.
Great.
If we look then at what do we need to be able to manage an organisation in this environment? So let's start at the highest level. Well, if you're looking at that world where the transformation's continuous, the organisation's continuously being driven forward, organisations are now in an environment where it's not about planning now and then going and hitting a particular given outcome. What the organisation wants to do is it wants to set up a system that continuously adapts. It wants to be able to see the environment it's in, enable it to respond to that environment, empower its complete set of capabilities and its people to respond and make that happen, and it needs to continuously execute and deliver outcomes to its target customers, to its stakeholders, and to its community. The organisation suddenly becomes an engine of continuously identifying opportunities and responding to those opportunities as it sees fit. And at the heart, an organisation is trying to respond to opportunities driven by this idea of purpose, of making an impact in the world. And so at that organisational system level, what we see is there's some critical capabilities that the organisation needs to have. It needs open management styles because it needs to be continuously able to see the execution occurring in the organisation and learn from that. It needs that growth-oriented learning culture to be able to take the insights out of its current activity and be able to translate those into opportunities. It needs an ability to see an entire system and think systemically about the organisation, its suppliers, its customers, its entire environment to be able to shape response. And obviously, given no response is guaranteed to be successful, it needs that kind of agile innovation approach to be continuously testing new ideas and advancing the agenda forward. And that set of 4 practices, which people might be familiar with, this reaches back to, you know, the kind of 5th discipline conversations of Peter Senge and others who were talking about the need to create a learning organisation. we're actually seeing that what was once rhetoric be translated into very specific actions now in organisations. We're starting to see organisations tackle each of these four quadrants in terms of the work they're doing. And that, I think, starts to define for a learning function where they need to be playing their roles. Because underpinning each of those four quadrants we're seeing there are specific capabilities that a learning function can step into building organisation-wide. They can step into influencing the culture and nature of work across the entire organisation by playing into those four quadrants there. And if we consider how a learning function might do that, here's an example of four specific areas of capability that organisations can build, and learning can lead the way. So starting in the top left quadrant, learning functions can help organisations to work out loud, to transform the nature of work, to support open management. Or learning functions can build personal knowledge management in the top right quadrant there, because what it does is it takes that culture of learning down to an individual set of behaviours to learn and to grow. And we'll talk through each of these four practices in more detail, but I wanted to connect them to that overall picture. Adaptive leadership is a new model of leadership that focuses on an individual's ability to play a role to influence an entire system. And it's very much about stepping beyond that kind of old hierarchical model of leadership and giving people the tools and techniques to work in a world that's driven by influence, not by control and hierarchical power. And lastly, experimentation is a core practice in any agile innovation system. And enabling learning through experimentation, designing experimentation into the way we learn wherever we do in the organisation, in programs, but importantly in the 70% on-the-job learning, becomes an important capability that learning can play in supporting the organisation as it moves forward.
I think so. Just to touch on your point about experimentation, I think there's that, I mean, even in learning, you know, historically we have been teaching people the right way to do things, and we're not allowing them to fail enough and make those mistakes to be able to get the valuable learnings from what we're trying to achieve. And I think it's giving permission for people to make mistakes, including ourselves.
Absolutely. I mean, we've now reached a world where every time, and the experimentation mindset applies to the work of learning as well. So
absolutely,
have a think that every time you put a program of learning into an organisation, it goes out as a test. It goes out as a test to compete with the vast learning resources that are available through YouTube, the learning resources that are available through managers, peer learning, grey market learning, other competitive sources in the organisation. I've done a lot of work in helping organisations develop new models of the corporate university, and it's interesting. One of the biggest concerns learning functions have is like, what if we build it and they don't come? And that really says, well, they're not. If your organisation is not coming and consuming the learning you've created, they must be getting that somewhere else.
Yeah.
If you believe you've delivered the right strategic learning, what you're being told is the way you've gone about it is a failed experiment. So adapt. Try something different. Go find out what they're actually doing and work with that. And that's a great example of how experimentation applies through everything. It's within the learning, but it's also the way learning itself goes about its function and its role. So if we just dig into each of those practices for just a minute. So working out loud is a global movement, and there's a number of great thought leaders in working out loud. Jane Bozarth has been talking for a long while about a related concept called share your work. John Stepper is probably the leading practitioner of working out loud. and has written a book, Working Out Loud for a Better Career in Life, which I think is something we can all have an ambition for. And really what Working Out Loud about is combining two elements, combining visibility of work and the and narration of work, sharing work in a purposeful way. And what John encourages people to think about is, how do relationships play a role in your work? What relationships are important to your work? How can you be more generous and make specific contributions to others in those relationships? How can sharing your work more visibly, how can that purpose contribute to your work? And importantly, how can you approach your work with a growth mindset? I'm picking up there on the work of the Stanford researcher Carol Dweck, who's identified that growth mindsets are a key element of higher performance in individuals, in children, and in others. And I think what this does so working out loud is a key practice that learning can foster in the organisation. There are specific ways, like working out loud circles, that learning can be built in organisations around this practice of working out loud. But importantly, working out loud is something that learning can play a key role in supporting and in building through the organisation.
I think, and indeed as well, like learning can actually start sort of practicing what they preach in terms of we can start working like this within our teams, and teams kind of across organisations as well, and within our community, to actually experiment with and then take to the business to show what we can do.
Absolutely. I mean, this isn't working out loud something that's a little alien to people at first, and people need role models. And I think when people have experienced working in a very different way, they can get dramatic, movement forward. I mean, I know in my own personal practice, I work out loud on almost all the development of new intellectual property, new ways of engaging clients that I do, because it is so valuable to have that shaped by my peers and by clients as part of that process. So another key practice that we talked about is this idea of personal knowledge mastery. So helping every individual to think about how they find the information they need, they go seek it out, they make sense of it, and translate it into something that they can make use of, get the valuable insights out of that, and then also how they share that out into their networks and their environment. Harold Jarkey has developed this Seek, Sense, Share framework. Harold has a fantastic blog that's available, publicly available at jarkey.com, and has some great learning programs. But the key here is around the role learning can play to create a continuous activity for individuals, communities, and the whole organisation to play this role of seeking out information, making sense of it, and sharing it. Because there's core network awareness that's required to do this. There's core learning processes and sense making that's really a challenge for individuals when they first start this. And importantly, individuals often don't start with the confidence to share information, to collaborate, to build those communities, and to develop collaboration across the organisation around these activities. But here's a role within programs, across programs, and across the organisation that learning can play to step out into supplying one of the important connecting blocks across those practices I was talking about before. Because something like personal knowledge management is a fundamental capability that drives effectiveness in design thinking. It drives effectiveness in agile. It drives effectiveness in innovation. So if you want to get the attention of your senior executives in your organisation who are trying to drive more agile, more innovation, more productivity, more continuous improvement, here's an opportunity to do that. I was interested the other day, I was reviewing some information around the Toyota University. So people might be aware Toyota is a global leader in continuous improvement and has done amazing work in enabling its employees to identify opportunities to improve the organisation and to put that into practice. So much so that Toyota receives over 1 million suggestions of process improvement from its employees every year and implements the vast majority of them. And Toyota's learning function focuses entirely on the problem-solving techniques, the sense-making techniques, the sharing and the working practices that enables its employees to do that. That they've got this fabulous ability to build the capability for its employees to see opportunities for improvement, to make sense of them, and then to be able to implement them as they move forward.
I think you got professional networks up there, and I think it's an important, when we're looking at all of this, I mean, the whole point of this is to give people actionable things they can go away and do now, to start making these changes. I think I'm still constantly surprised by the number of people in our industry who are not yet on LinkedIn. Certainly LinkedIn they should be, but and Twitter as well. Both of those things you can go in today and set up accounts on and start having a poke around and seeing what discussions are happening and what things are available to you, and actually extending that professional network. I mean, I think my network to me is the most valuable thing in my working life, and my personal life, I suppose. But the value that I get from that network and I'm able to give back to that network is immense, and it's only getting stronger. We have more places to connect and share. There's no sort of barriers. So, I mean, this is a perfect example. You and I had not actually physically met before we did this session, but because of that sort of connectedness and the networks and the people that I have around me, I was able to reach out to you through the technology and say, Simon, could you come be a part of this event? And here we are. It's a prime example of what you can do.
Yeah, I mean, I've got an example, Karen, where a community of practice that I'm a part of wrote a book together when none of us had actually met.
Yeah.
We just had a common approach to how we went about it. Everyone made their contributions. Individuals took on the role of bringing that together, editing it, and so on. And I think if people aren't aware of the networks that are around them, if people aren't specifically seeking out communities of practice that can help them develop their understanding of the practices that are important to their work, we are in an environment where the rate of pace of change in learning, driven by some pretty innovative examples out there. I mean, if people haven't looked at Khan Academy and how it's tackling, new ways of teaching kids. It began with mathematics. It's now reaching out well beyond mathematics, but using YouTube videos. There's really innovative examples that individuals should be looking at in their work and challenging how they apply those to their roles and working with others in similar communities to understand what best practice looks like, what better practice looks like, and where the edge innovations are coming from. Because this idea of continuous improvement is very much about being able to identify edge opportunities when they first occur, pick them up and implement them fast. Because that will give you that continuous improvement opportunity.
Definitely.
So to be able to look at the next practice, to be able to actually implement something, you need an individual it feels like they've got a sense of agency in the world. They've got feels like a sense of that making change is their responsibility. And this is where this practice of adaptive leadership comes in. If we think of traditional ideas of leadership, it's role-based, it's based around power over individuals, it's very hierarchically oriented. A few people get to make decisions, everyone else gets to do. To survive in this world of continuous change, we need everyone capable of identifying opportunities and responding to them. And importantly, in a connected world, it's much less about power over and much more about influence on and influence into networks. And even when we think about communities of practice and the networks around us, individuals need to be thinking about what's their influence, what's their personal brand, how are they known, what opportunities do they have to drive change. And Ronald Heifetz, Marty Linsky and others from Harvard have done fantastic work describing a specific set of leadership practices that organisations and individuals can foster that help them manage really complex scenarios and start to make those opportunities to influence systemic change and to step away from very transactional models that we've had in the past. And so I think anyone who works in learning should invest the time to understand the approaches of adaptive leadership. There's a fantastic HBR article by Heifetz and Linsky called The Work of Leadership, which is a great starting point. The book, which you see there, The Practice of Adaptive Leadership, is really their manual that gives you an in-depth opportunity to dive into these. This adaptive leadership is valuable for learning professionals at a personal level. It will help them increase their influence in the organisation. It'll help them get their voice to the table and be able to drive change and work through some of the barriers that they meet with business partners. It'll also help them rethink how they might frame some of the common hierarchical assumptions that we build into the learning we have. You know, there is often far more opportunity for individuals to drive change in organisations than they are aware, and being able to enable people to realise that opportunity to drive change is one, a fabulous sense of purpose comes from that. Individuals feel far more satisfied when they've actually been able to create something or make change happen as a result of their own agency.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is a key technique, and organisations need new models of leadership when they start to work in this connected network world.
Definitely.
So if we look at the final practice, sorry, hang on a second, it's frozen for a second here.
Mm-hmm.
The final practice is around experimentation, and we've touched on this as well. We live in a world where the most sophisticated organisations are continuously turning ideas into hypotheses and testing them. They're running sophisticated tests to learn from the outcome of those tests. And as we said before, this is a practice that individuals really need to think through and drive into their work. And importantly, it's the awareness that experimentation and innovation is all about that learning. It's all about individuals continuously getting a better understanding of the world, gaining knowledge, but importantly, gaining the capability to do something with that knowledge. And I think this is where there's a key role. So whether it's helping build the experimentation culture in your organisation by picking up on lean startup practices, by picking up on agile and building those capabilities into your organisation, by building continuous improvement, or just as we talked before in that Toyota example, there are many ways that learning functions can help the organisation to foster that culture of continuous improvement. And obviously, as we spoke before, learning can play a critical role in testing and learning on the way we go into our work. Because what we do when we put things to the test is we often discover there are better ways of building the capability. I was working recently with a client, and we actually discovered that rather than building new learning programs, the area we were working in was around digital capability. And actually what we found was that the leading edge of digital capability moves so rapidly and is driven so much by innovative organisations, particularly startups, which are operating on a global scale, that we spent the time to develop a program. By the time we developed the program, it was almost guaranteed to be out of date and behind the best practice of individuals in the organisation. What we actually spent our time doing was experimenting with a series of ways that we could curate learning opportunities coming out of sites like lynda.com, coming off YouTube, coming out of the world's best conferences, coming out of communities of practice, coming out of other events. So we actually started to think about experimenting with curating a learning journey for individuals and involving the individuals as part of the curators of that journey as well. We actually challenged people in the organisation to find the best learning they were aware of and share that with their colleagues and work through that. And that experiment developed quite a radically different way of building that digital capability in the organisation, and one that was fundamentally open to learning from the best of what the world had at each point in time and sharing that back into the organisation. There's a very different approach to thinking about digital capability for an organisation that's business depends upon it being right at the leading edge of capability in many spheres in digital in their organisation.
It's interesting.
And so what we're really seeing there is that we've reached a point now where learning is the core challenge for organisations, and that challenge for learning in the organisations gives learning a strategic imperative to connect to. The challenge for our learning functions is that learning needs to insert itself in that dialogue, because what we're seeing is that at the moment, in many cases, that role of learning is not necessarily framed as a learning challenge. It may not be learning using the best techniques that learning's aware of to drive this, but importantly, we've got an opportunity here for learning to step into this conversation and bring a specific set of practices to bear on that challenge and to really help organisations and individuals to move forward into the future of work.
Absolutely. That's really interesting. Thank you, Simon. And we're actually going to just pull together a little handout to go along with this session that you guys can take away and start working with your teams on those actionable points that Simon's made. So I just want to thank you very much for taking your time to come and share all of that with us, Simon. If you want to, if anyone wants to contact Simon, his details are on screen there for Twitter, and also will be in the show notes. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. It was great to have a conversation.